The artificial gravity on Station Virel 9 wasn't perfect. Caleb felt it in his knees every time he ran drills. Slightly too heavy, like someone had cranked Earth's gravity up just enough to make him slower, duller. Not that he complained. He didn't complain about anything. Not about the Zithari food rations that made him nauseous. Not about the water that tasted like filtered algae. Not even about Instructor Javrex. Especially not about Javrex. The corridor to the youth barracks buzzed with evening announcements in half a dozen alien dialects, but Caleb tuned them out. He walked with his duffel slung over his shoulder, sweat cooling under his regulation undersuit, his fists lightly clenched from a day's worth of restraint. His bunkmates, most of them taller, scalier, or multi-limbed, watched him like one might watch a prototype weapon, untested and potentially unstable. Some kept their distance, others stared too long. Humans didn't belong here. That message, while never said outright, was transmitted in 1,000 little ways. The Coalition's youth training program was the galaxy's boldest diplomatic experiment. Teenagers from across member worlds trained together, supposedly to learn shared combat strategy. In reality, it was a social pressure cooker on the edge of deep space, and Caleb, at 14, was its youngest and most scrutinized member. Deadweight, one of the Sartex twins had muttered last week. Not to Caleb's face, never that bold, but loud enough for him to hear. And Javrex? He didn't hide his contempt behind mutters. During the first week, the Zithari combat instructor had circled Caleb like a vulture, mandibles twitching not in curiosity, but derision. "This one," he'd announced to the group. "You send this soft-skinned fledgling as a warrior? Is it not still suckling?" That got laughs. Caleb didn't laugh. He bowed. Respectfully. Like his father taught him. Restraint is strength. Control is power. But control frayed under repeated tension. Each week, Javrex found new ways to apply pressure. He'd assign Caleb twice the running distance as the others, claiming human physiology demanded it. He'd interrupt Caleb's sparring with corrections that made no sense, and paired him only with partners who saw him as a liability or a curiosity. Once, he flooded the training room with simulated cold, explaining that Earthlings must learn to overcome fragility. Still, Caleb said nothing. Not to the tribunal mediators, not to the human liaison, not even to the 2 other humans stationed on Viril 9, both years older and careful to keep professional distance. Only at night, under the thin synth fabric blankets, did his body tremble, not with fear, but with held-back adrenaline. His muscles remembered what he wouldn't let them do. His father had warned him it would be like this. "One day someone will try to break you," he had said, seated cross-legged on the family dojo floor in Phoenix, Arizona. "And your strength won't be in your fists, it'll be in knowing when not to use them." But that was Earth. This was Virel 9. And today, Javrex crossed a line. It started during standard formation drills in Base C. The other cadets were arranged by species. Caleb stood in the far corner, already dripping with sweat. Javrex's voice, translated through the station's embedded audio feed, barked over them in perfect galactic standard. "For this next demonstration, we will assess reaction speed. I will strike only once. You must evade." One by one, Javrex approached cadets, moved slowly at first, then faster. The exercise was intended to be controlled, instructional. But then he called Caleb forward. The room stilled. "Step into the ring," Javrex said, his yellow eyes locked on Caleb. Caleb stepped forward. "Unarmed, no stance. Do not move until I move." Caleb nodded. He dropped his shoulders, opened his hands. Neutral posture. The Zithari circled him. "You believe yourself disciplined," Javrex said, loudly enough for everyone to hear. "You think silence makes you stronger. But silence, little Deathworlder, is not the same as strength." And then he struck. Not a slow, telegraphed motion like with the others. A full-body slap, open-handed, angled, meant to disorient. It landed across Caleb's face with a crack that echoed off the training walls. His head snapped sideways, eyes blinking as his balance shifted. He staggered back half a step. Gasps followed. No one moved. Caleb straightened slowly, his cheek flushed red, already beginning to swell. But he didn't touch it, he didn't speak. Javrex turned away, smug. As I thought, all restraint, no. It happened so fast, no one saw the full movement. Caleb shifted, a pivot off his back foot. Right shoulder dipped, left hand caught Javrex's outstretched arm, redirected. Momentum carried. He stepped in, used the alien's own size against him, hip turned. A perfect rotational throw. Mid-spin. His right arm rose and locked at the back of Javrex's neck and twisted sharply. Oh, crack. It wasn't loud, not loud like in movies. But in the silence that followed, it sounded like a dry branch splitting under weight. Javrex collapsed before anyone could blink. His body hit the ground in a heap of twitching limbs, eyes wide, mouth open. And then the screaming started. A Centauri cadet vomited. One of the Sartex twins fainted. Someone activated the emergency med panel beacon, and medics stormed the room seconds later. Caleb stepped back, breathing evenly. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He simply waited. They told him later Javrex had survived. Barely. Cervical vertebrae damage. Emergency neural stabilization. Temporary paralysis, pending surgical reinforcement. The prognosis was better than it should have been. No one said it, but some credited Caleb's precision. There had been no extra movement, no cruelty. Just a devastating technique, trained, practiced, deliberate. Too deliberate. Within the hour, Caleb was in detention. Not a cell, but not a student room either. Surveillance watched his every move. Medical scans showed elevated cortisol, slight bruising on his face, but otherwise stable vitals. The tribunal convened the next morning. A panel of 6. 2 from the Coalition Council, 1 human diplomat, and 3 species with military training experience. The room was neutral, if sterile, lit in soft blues to encourage calm. Caleb stood at the center, his feet bare, his face still red. No one spoke for a long time. Then, Counselor Vrith opened the record. Caleb of Earth, do you understand why you are here? Yes. You are accused of deliberate assault on a Coalition instructor, resulting in spinal trauma and long-term mobility impairment. I understand. Do you have anything to say in your defense? Caleb looked up. His voice was clear, measured. I did it on purpose, and I'd do it again. Silence. He scanned the panel. This wasn't the first time he tried to humiliate me, Caleb said. Just the first time I answered back. I've trained my entire life. I'm not a threat to the Coalition, but I won't be treated like prey. The room didn't explode, it imploded, with silence, with glances, with the weight of too many assumptions suddenly collapsing inward. This was not the frightened reaction of a child. This was a statement. Measured, calculated, final. And it would change everything. By the second hour after the hearing, the footage had already leaked. Not officially, of course. Coalition security protocols were airtight on paper. But someone in the observer gallery, an aide, a cadet with high-level clearance, or a technician with a grudge, had copied the tribunal feed. Within cycles, the incident became the most watched video on every internal Coalition network. The slap, the pivot, the crack. Looped, paused, studied. By the third hour, it had made it onto 3 alien educational forums, 5 military symposium boards, and a xenopsychology blog titled, What Happens When You Corner a Deathworlder Cub? The panic spread faster than the video. On Level 16, Sector D, Commander Tralvin of the Dithari fleet watched the footage with his primary eyes half-lidded, jaw tight. His secondary set of hands paused the recording at the exact moment Caleb executed the throw. That, he muttered, is a child? Yes, sir. The officer beside him confirmed. Tralvin clicked his beak softly and leaned back. And we let this species in why, exactly? Joint Development Initiative. Long-term peace strategy. Potential defensive alliance. Potential annihilation, more like. Tralvin's aide didn't respond. The silence was answer enough. Meanwhile, in the infirmary wing, Javrex stared at the ceiling, unmoving. His body was swaddled in neural webbing, microtensors aligning the vertebrae as surgical nanites slowly repaired the damage. He could breathe on his own, speak if he chose, but he hadn't. The medtechs left his screen interface active for now. No one questioned his repeated replaying of the incident, over and over. Each time with a different filter muscle vector overlay, gravitational mapping, kinetic output models. He never said a word, but he watched. Caleb sat on the floor of the temporary observation suite, legs folded, back straight. He hadn't spoken since the tribunal. A coalition officer brought him meals. He ate without complaint. They ran 3 scans in 48 hours. Neural stress levels, adrenaline baseline, reflex latency, all within expectations for someone under duress. The medical examiner, a tall Kolari female with dusky skin and silver eyes, took longer than most to file her report. Her assistant asked why. She shrugged. I've never seen a child whose biofeedback looks like a tactical operations veteran. I just needed a second look. He'd been taught not to cry. That didn't mean he wasn't hurting. His face still ached. His jaw clicked when he moved it. The swelling had faded, but every time he shifted his weight, a bolt of tension ran up his spine. Restraint was harder now. The worst part wasn't the waiting, it was the silence. No messages from Earth, no contact from his father. The human delegation had assured him support was on the way, but all Caleb could think about was whether he'd be sent back, whether everything he'd endured was now meaningless, whether he'd be labeled dangerous, or worse, weak. The tribunal didn't reconvene, but they issued an interim statement. Cadet Caleb of Earth is to be suspended from all physical training modules, pending psychological evaluation and cultural compatibility review. He will remain on Station Varel 9 under supervision. No expulsion to be enacted at this time. It read neutral, but everyone knew what it meant. A Deathworlder child had crippled an elite Zithari instructor with a single movement. No one was ready for that sentence. Reactions across the station split hard and fast. Some cadets avoided Caleb entirely, stepping out of corridors when they saw him. Others stared. A few whispered as he passed, but not like before. There was no laughter now, just uncertainty. Caution. One young Martok girl approached him in the mess hall. You didn't panic, she said, holding a tray of steaming protein fungi. No, Caleb answered quietly. Is that what humans do, when they're angry? No, he said again, only when they've had enough. She nodded, then sat down beside him and ate without another word. It was the first time in weeks someone chose to sit with him. Behind closed doors, the coalition scrambled. New training protocols were drafted, species-specific cultural conflict models were updated. A full psych brief on Deathworlder maturation cycles was commissioned from the Terran Diplomatic Office. Several council members demanded a re-evaluation of human inclusion in the youth program altogether. He is only 14, one Centauri representative argued. What happens when these children reach maturity? Will they snap limbs instead of necks? They already train their young in combat, a Vralishi delegate added. This is a martial culture, perhaps not a peaceful one. To that, the human ambassador, an older man named Donovan Hale, responded with uncharacteristic sharpness. You invited humanity into your coalition, he said, his voice quiet but firm. You knew we were from a death world. You've seen our histories. You wanted our resilience, our tactical minds, our creativity. But now that we show you what it means to be shaped by hardship, you flinch? No one answered. He continued. Caleb was trained. Yes, not for war, for discipline. He was provoked over weeks by an instructor who violated basic tenets of mentorship, and when he finally responded, he didn't kill. He didn't lash out. He executed a precise, controlled counter-movement, one that would have been non-lethal had the instructor's anatomy been better understood. Had the roles been reversed, Hale added, if Javrex had snapped Caleb's neck, would you still be holding a tribunal? The room remained silent. A week passed. Caleb remained under suspension, but was allowed to resume academic modules. He received a message, his first from Earth, a simple text-only note. All in dojo. Master Hale. Subject, empty cup. Message. The still river cuts deeper than the raging flood. I saw the video. I'm proud of your control. Heal. Train. Remember, the world will not understand you. That's not your fault. But it is your burden. Caleb stared at the message for a long time. Then he went to the gym. He trained alone now. No instructors, no partners, just the low hum of servo motors and padded floors. He wasn't allowed to use combat programs, but that didn't matter. His father's voice guided him. Elbow angles, breathing control, balance under duress. Every movement was slow, deliberate. His body still ached, his ribs bruised from the earlier impact. His right shoulder clicked ominously when he twisted too fast. The station medic had warned him soft tissue injuries, especially in growth stage adolescence, took time to heal. Weeks, sometimes months. So he moved carefully. Not to fight, but to remember how not to. From behind the observation glass, a figure watched. Not officially, not every day, but often enough to be noticed. Javrex. The instructor had been transferred to a mobile assist unit, half cybernetic brace, half walking frame. He never requested meetings, never offered statements. But he watched the boy who had bested him, quietly, repeatedly. Some said he was planning revenge. Others weren't so sure. Late one rotation, a private message arrived at the tribunal chamber. Unofficial, unstamped. It contained no request for appeal, no complaint. Just a single line of text. Do not destroy the footage. I will need to see it again. The sender? Havrex. No one spoke of it aloud. But the implications spread like radiation. Caleb's room had a small window. Not to space station quarters weren't that luxurious, but to the internal arboretum, a dome filled with imported Earth flora. He sat by it one night, watching the artificial breeze rustle synthetic birch leaves. His face was no longer swollen, but a dull ache remained in his jaw. He wasn't angry, but he wasn't at peace either. And, somewhere in that equilibrium between rage and stillness, he realized something the tribunal hadn't. They hadn't been afraid of him. They were afraid of what he represented. Not just strength, not even violence, but the capacity for mastery at such a young age. The truth that a human child, trained in silence and tested in restraint, could choose to be dangerous and then choose not to be. And that made him something new in their eyes. Not a weapon. A warning. Caleb didn't know if they'd ever let him back into full training. They let him return to lectures first, strictly non-physical modules, tactics, coalition law, comparative anatomy. He sat in the rear rows, solitary but never ignored. Cadets who once rolled their eyes now glanced at him as if proximity alone might warrant caution. The whispering hadn't stopped, but it had changed. It wasn't mockery anymore. It was reverence, edged with fear. The Zathari contingent never looked at him. Not directly. Some cadets assumed he'd been coached by Terran Special Forces. Others suspected cybernetic enhancement or chemical conditioning. None of that was true, and Caleb didn't correct them. There was no pride in the rumors, just space where the truth didn't fit cleanly. He'd trained since he was 4. Not for war. Not for moments like this. But now, everything about him was being reinterpreted through that single motion, the snap of muscle, the twist of bone, the fall of a body larger than his own. The coalition panel was still deliberating. Caleb hadn't been expelled, but he wasn't reinstated either. His file now carried 2 flagged annotations: controlled self-defense and culturally disruptive. What exactly that meant for his future was unclear. In a private session, one of the human program advisors, a thin, exhausted woman named Meredith Shaw, pulled him aside after a de-escalation seminar. She spoke softly, like she was trying not to scare him. "You understand what you did, Caleb?" "Yes," he said. "I mean the effect, the symbolism. You weren't just a student in that moment, you became a mirror. You showed them what they don't understand about us." "I didn't want to." "I know." She paused. "But now they'll define you by it." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. They both understood that the act, no matter how justified, had become bigger than the boy who committed it. That week, the tribunal commissioned an interspecies psychological review panel. Not for Caleb. For the others. To study why the incident had triggered such profound discomfort among cadets and instructors. Experts presented theories: threat response, escalation, predator-prey inversion, cultural mismatch of honor ethics, the illusion of control over human potential. A Venari sociologist summed it up in one sentence: "We assumed Deathworlders would struggle to meet our standards. We never prepared for them to exceed them." Days later, the gym was reopened to him cautiously, under supervision. But this time, he wasn't alone. Commander Reith of the Vectari volunteered for the first reintroduction session. Reith wasn't young. His carapace bore the silver ridges of age, and his top set of arms were cybernetic. But he was known across the coalition for his even temper and cross-cultural discipline coaching. He greeted Caleb without disdain, pity, or fear, just a shallow nod. You may train, Reith said, within bounds. What bounds? Reith stepped onto the mat. No holds, no throws, only motion and form. You move. I observe. Caleb obeyed. For an hour, he performed kata forms his father had burned into muscle memory years ago. Stances rooted in earth soil, but now practiced on synthetic tiling under artificial lights. Reith said nothing until the end. Then he approached. That technique you used, he said. Where did you learn it? My father, Caleb replied. He calls it redirected apex. It was not designed for Zithari anatomy. No, yet it worked. Yes. Reith stared for a long moment. You knew it would? I studied their gait, the way they carry weight in their thoracic spine. A pause. You studied your instructor, Reith said slowly, knowing he might attack you. Caleb didn't answer. He didn't need to. Reith's secondary arms folded behind him. That is not the mind of a soldier. That is the mind of a tactician. Caleb blinked. Is that worse? For some, Reith said, it is more frightening. Then he walked out, leaving Caleb alone again, but this time, with permission. Elsewhere on the station, Javrex began physical therapy. Coalition medics were advanced, but his injury had been severe. Cervical stabilization was successful, and he could now walk short distances with the aid of a spinal harness. Fine motor function was still delayed. He spoke for the first time 14 days after the injury. Not to a tribunal, not to a friend, to his physical therapist. What is the human status? He asked, voice dry and slow. The therapist hesitated. Still in the program, training independently. Under review. Javrex didn't respond, but he flexed his claws, testing the limits of his damaged neural response. By week 4, things had changed. The curriculum changed. Not overtly, but instructors now offered disclaimers when discussing hand-to-hand engagement. Species-specific leverage varies. Do not assume standard techniques apply to humans. The psychological maturity of a Deathworlder adolescent does not imply limited physical capability. Do not provoke cultural confrontation under the guise of instruction. And quietly, behind closed doors, commanders met to draft a new policy: combat risk indexing by species. Humans were to be listed at Tier 2B, formerly reserved for hardened military conscripts. The only juvenile species rated at that level. Not because of strength. Because of intent. Then, something unexpected happened. 3 cadets, each from different species, approached Caleb in the Arboretum. Not with accusations, with questions. How do you know how to stay calm? Asked a Graythan girl, nervous and wide-eyed. What would you have done if he hit you again? Asked a Quarren male, voice tinged with curiosity rather than challenge. Will you teach me? Asked a young Tharn, who'd previously avoided eye contact with Caleb for a month. He didn't answer immediately, not because he didn't want to, because he wasn't sure. He wasn't a teacher. He was still learning how to exist in a space that now feared and admired him in equal measure. But he agreed. And the next morning, under the soft lighting of the auxiliary training dome, Caleb showed them breathing techniques, not attacks, not counters. Just how to breathe when someone tries to break you. Javrex returned to the training floor the following week. A walking brace supported his posture, his arms moved stiffly, but he walked without assistance. His first session back was with a group of new recruits, none from Earth. He said little, demonstrated slowly. Observed often. But once, just once, his gaze met the observation window on level 3, where Caleb had been watching silently. They locked eyes. Javrex gave a single, slow nod. It wasn't apology. It wasn't forgiveness. It was acknowledgement. The boy had passed the trial he was never meant to survive. And now, the galaxy would adapt. Or it would fall behind. Station Varel 9 was quieter in the weeks that followed, not physically, but in its tension. Cadets still trained, officers still lectured, and ships still came and went from the outer ring docks, but something beneath the routines had shifted. No more whispered doubts about whether humans belonged. Now, the question was different. How do you live with a species that refuses to break the way you expect? Caleb didn't ask to be the answer, but he was the one they looked at now, even when they thought he didn't notice. The curiosity wasn't hostile anymore. It was uncertain, sometimes respectful, sometimes wary, but always watching. He didn't flinch from it. What surprised him most was that the solitude hurt less now. He still trained alone, most days, not by rule anymore, just by habit. His physical clearance had returned in full 2 weeks prior. Once station medics were satisfied with joint recovery, neural integrity, and post-trauma muscle fatigue markers. His cheekbones still carried a faint discoloration from the slap, a deep yellow bruise that faded slowly, like a mark from another lifetime. The doctors had offered tissue regen for it. He declined. Let them see it, he thought. Let them remember. He practiced differently now. Not just with his body, but with intention. He tested motions as if someone else might be watching, not to impress, but to show restraint. He shortened his kicks. Deliberately softened throws. When he hit the ground in rolls, he held a breath longer than needed, remembering the echo of bone under skin. He trained like someone who had already been feared once, and wasn't eager to be feared again. Then, a message arrived. Encrypted. Coalition diplomatic seal. Human priority. He opened it in his bunk, flanked by empty sleeping pods. From Hail, Donovan Father. Subject, discharge status. Message. I've reviewed the panel's decision. You're not being pulled. I fought for that. So did others. They saw you for who you are, not just what you did. You held your ground the right way. You said what needed to be said, and more importantly, you knew when to stop. Son, I've taught a lot of fighters, grown men, military officers, but very few could have done what you did, not the move, the restraint before it, the aftermath. You're going to stay there, learn, teach if they ask, be who you are, and let the world adapt. And remember, strength is never the question, it's always the answer to someone else's. Caleb read it 3 times, before finally allowing his chest to loosen. He exhaled like he hadn't in weeks. The Coalition's final ruling was announced a week later. Cadet Caleb of Earth would remain a full member of the youth training program on Station Varel 9. His combat permissions were reinstated. His record would note the event not as an infraction, but as a cultural trigger incident resulting in a controlled defensive response. The phrase was bureaucratic, sanitized, but it mattered. It meant he wasn't a liability. He was now a case study. Changes rippled outward. The Coalition issued a new directive. All cadets were to undergo training in Deathworlder physiology and developmental psychology. Not just for humans, for any high-resilience species where aggression, defense, and self-control evolved alongside survival. It wasn't called the Caleb Rule, but everyone knew it started with him. Training simulations were updated. Instructors revised protocols for adolescent engagement. And, quietly, a new optional module was added to the advanced curriculum. Cross-species de-escalation, human approach models. Some cadets signed up out of curiosity. Others, out of fear. A few out of genuine respect. Javrex returned to teaching 6 weeks after the incident. He walked slower. His movements were more deliberate. He still commanded authority, still corrected posture with a sharp tone, but something fundamental had changed in him. He stopped mocking students. He started asking questions before giving orders. And most notably, during one lecture on redirection tactics, he paused and said, "There is no such thing as a universal opponent. Expecting one will get you broken." He didn't mention Caleb. He didn't need to. But later that week, he stood outside the auxiliary gym while Caleb ran solo drills. The boy noticed. He bowed not low, not submissive. Just a nod, the kind 2 warriors give before a bout they won't fight. Javrex inclined his head, then turned and walked away. Months passed. Caleb grew physically, emotionally, quietly. The younger cadets no longer avoided him. Some joined him during cooldowns. Others asked about his earth training. A Tharn boy offered to teach him how to regulate internal body temperature through glandular focus. In exchange, Caleb showed him how to stabilize a broken wrist. The exchange felt right. Balanced. He received occasional messages from home, his father, Earth's diplomatic corps, even a few martial arts students from back in Arizona who had heard some version of what happened. He never corrected them. Let the myths take root where truth couldn't follow. It wasn't until the program's semi-annual showcase that he felt the full weight of what had changed. Each species was asked to demonstrate a skill unique to their culture, Some performed forms of battle, others intricate dances, linguistic mimicry, even memory displays. When it was Caleb's turn, he stood barefoot in the center ring. He performed a kata called Still Stream, Rising Stone. No aggression, no contact. Just movement, fluid, grounded, balanced. His limbs flowed with the quiet strength of someone who had nothing left to prove. When he finished, there was no applause. Not right away. Just a long silence. And then a Vralishi instructor, who had once argued to expel him, stood and said, "I did not understand your people before, I still do not, but I will not doubt their children again." It was the closest thing to reconciliation the coalition knew how to offer. Later that night, alone in the arboretum, Caleb sat beneath a metal-framed birch tree. The leaves rustled in artificial wind. A small holopad rested in his lap, playing archived footage of the Earth Dojo where he'd first trained. His father's voice echoed through the tiny speaker. "One day, someone will try to break you. Your strength isn't in your fists, it's in when you don't use them." He closed his eyes and let the words settle, not like a warning this time, but like a promise already kept. He wasn't the same boy who stepped onto Virel 9 hoping to prove he belonged. Now, they all knew he did. Not because of what he could do, but because of what he chose not to.